The candle flame trembled. Lord Carnarvon held it closer to the small hole they had chiseled through the sealed doorway, and for a moment no one breathed. Howard Carter knelt beside him in the narrow corridor, the air thick with the dust of 3,000 years, his heart hammering against his ribs. Somewhere behind them, the Egyptian winter night pressed cold and indifferent against the Valley of the Kings. But here, in this cramped passage carved from living rock, something ancient and enormous was waiting. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon whispered. Carter's eye pressed against the opening. The candle flame bent inward, pulled by the breath of a sealed world. And then, as his vision adjusted to the impossible darkness beyond, shapes began to emerge. Gold. Everywhere, gold. Creatures, statues, glittering objects piled one upon another in breathtaking abundance. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "Yes," he said, "wonderful things." It was November 26, 1922. What Howard Carter and Lord Carnarvon had just discovered would become the most celebrated archaeological find in human history. But within months, people connected to that moment would begin to die. Some would fall to mysterious illness. Others would succumb to circumstances so strange that even the most rational minds would pause and wonder. The newspapers would call it the Curse of Tutankhamun. And the world, hungry for mystery and magic in the aftermath of a devastating war, would believe every word. But what was really happening in that golden tomb? Was there a curse? And if there was, what form did it truly take? To understand the story of the curse, you first have to understand the story of the boy king himself, and the extraordinary lengths to which ancient Egyptians went to protect their dead. Tutankhamun was born around 1341 BCE, during one of the most turbulent periods in Egyptian history. His father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, had done something almost incomprehensible for his time. He had dismantled the entire Egyptian religious system, banned the worship of the traditional gods, and declared that only one deity mattered, Aten, the sun disk. Akhenaten moved the capital city, renamed himself, and forced his people into a religious revolution that left them confused, frightened, and deeply resentful. When Akhenaten died, the priests of the old gods moved swiftly. The young prince, barely 9 years old, was placed on the throne. His name was changed from Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten, to Tutankhamun, meaning living image of Amun, the old chief god whose worship was being restored. The child king was a puppet in the hands of powerful advisors, particularly a general named Horemheb and a royal official named Ai, who together guided the kingdom back toward traditional religion and away from the chaos Akhenaten had created. Tutankhamun ruled for approximately 10 years. He was not a great conqueror. He was not a builder of monuments on the scale of Ramesses or Thutmose. He was a young man who loved hunting, who suffered from various physical ailments, including a clubfoot and malaria, and who died around the age of 19 under circumstances that remain debated to this day. His skull shows evidence of a blow to the back of the head. Whether this was the cause of death, an accident, or something more sinister has never been conclusively determined. What happened after his death was equally strange. His successor, the elderly Ai, performed the burial rites. Then Horemheb took power and did something remarkable in its cruelty. He systematically erased Tutankhamun from history. The boy king's name was chiseled from monuments. His image was destroyed. His cartouches were replaced with those of other pharaohs. For all practical purposes, Tutankhamun ceased to exist in the official record of Egyptian civilization. This erasure, intended as a final humiliation, turned out to be the greatest gift history could have given him. Because when tomb robbers and later pharaohs looted and repurposed the royal tombs of the Valley of the Kings, they were working from lists and records of known kings. Tutankhamun was not on those lists. His tomb, modest by royal standards, and tucked beneath the rubble and debris from the construction of a later pharaoh's tomb, went unnoticed. For over 3,000 years, it sat undisturbed, until Howard Carter decided he was going to find it. Carter was not a typical Egyptologist of his era. He had not come from wealth or privilege. Born in England in 1874, he was the son of an artist and had trained as a draftsman. He came to Egypt at 17 to help copy tomb paintings, and the ancient world seized him completely. He spent decades working in the Valley of the Kings, developing an encyclopedic knowledge of its geography and history, and he became convinced, based on a handful of artifacts that had appeared on the antiquities market bearing Tutankhamun's name, that the boy king's tomb had never been found. Most of his colleagues thought he was chasing a ghost. The Valley of the Kings had been thoroughly excavated, they said. There was nothing left to find. Carter needed a patron, someone with deep pockets and a willingness to gamble on an obsessive theory. He found one in George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. Carnarvon was a wealthy English aristocrat who had come to Egypt originally for his health, having been badly injured in an automobile accident years earlier. His lungs were weak, and the dry Egyptian air suited him. He had developed a passion for archaeology and had been funding excavations for years. When Carter pitched him the idea of a systematic search for Tutankhamun's tomb, Carnarvon agreed. They worked together for years, digging methodically through the valley, finding nothing of consequence. By 1922, Carnarvon was ready to give up. The money had been flowing out for 6 years with almost nothing to show for it. He called Carter to his estate in England and told him he was prepared to end the project. Carter made one final appeal. "Give me one more season," he said. "Just one more. If we find nothing, I will accept it." Carnarvon agreed. Carter returned to Egypt in October 1922 and resumed digging near the entrance to the tomb of Ramesses VI. On November 4th, just 3 days into the new season, one of his workman's tools struck something hard beneath the rubble. A step, then another step, then a staircase descending into the earth, leading to a sealed doorway bearing the royal necropolis seal. Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact, recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations." Carnarvon arrived on November 23. 3 days later came that moment with the candle, the darkness, and the wonderful things. What they found when they fully entered the tomb over the following days and weeks was staggering. 4 rooms, packed with over 5,000 objects. Furniture, chariots, weapons, clothing, jewelry, food, wine, statues, games, and at the center of it all, nested like a set of extraordinary Russian dolls, the burial chamber itself. 4 gilded shrines, one inside the other. A stone sarcophagus. 3 coffins. The innermost made of solid gold, weighing over 240 pounds. And within that final coffin, wrapped in linen, adorned with a golden mask of heartbreaking beauty, the mummy of a teenage boy who had been forgotten for 3 millennia. The world went absolutely mad. News of the discovery spread around the globe within days. Newspapers devoted their front pages to it. The public, still traumatized by the First World War and hungry for wonder and mystery, consumed every detail. Carnarvon, recognizing the commercial value of what they had found, sold exclusive rights to cover the story to a major newspaper, a decision that infuriated other journalists and set the stage for what was about to happen. Because the journalists who were excluded from official coverage needed something to write about, and they found it in a story that was far more compelling than archaeology. The curse. There are different versions of where the curse story began. One popular account claims that a tablet was found near the entrance to the tomb, bearing an inscription warning that death would come on swift wings to those who disturbed the pharaoh's rest. Carter's own records make no mention of such a tablet, and no such artifact appears in the official inventory of the tomb's contents. Most Egyptologists believe this inscription was either fabricated by journalists or was a misrepresentation of a different text entirely. But the story had a life of its own. And then Lord Carnarvon died. On March 6, 1923, just a few months after the tomb was opened, Carnarvon was shaving in his room at a Cairo hotel when his razor nicked a mosquito bite on his cheek. The bite became infected. The infection spread to his blood. In an era before antibiotics, blood poisoning was often a death sentence. Carnarvon developed pneumonia. He grew delirious with fever, reportedly murmuring about a winged creature in his final hours. On April 5, 1923, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon died at the age of 56. At the moment of his death, according to accounts published afterward, all the lights in Cairo went out simultaneously. And back in England, at his family estate, his dog howled once and dropped dead. Whether these events actually occurred as described is impossible to verify, but they were reported, and in the superheated atmosphere of global fascination surrounding the tomb, they ignited a firestorm. Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of the supremely rational Sherlock Holmes and, paradoxically, a passionate believer in the supernatural, told reporters that Carnarvon's death could be explained by elementals created by the ancient Egyptian priests to guard the tomb. The story exploded. Every subsequent death of anyone remotely connected to the discovery was scrutinized for signs of the curse at work, and people did keep dying. George J. Gould, an American financier who had visited the tomb, died of pneumonia in May 1923. Arthur Mace, one of Carter's archaeological assistants, fell into a mysterious decline and died in 1928. Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's half-brother who had visited Egypt around the time of the discovery, died in September 1923. Richard Bethel, Carter's personal secretary, was found dead in his bed in 1929. Bethel's elderly father, Lord Westbury, died in 1930 after falling from a window. As his hearse made its way through London, it reportedly struck and killed a young boy. The list grew. Journalists compiled it eagerly. By some counts, over a dozen people connected to the discovery died within a decade. The curse, it seemed, was real, except that it almost certainly was not. When researchers in later decades applied statistical analysis to the deaths surrounding the tomb's opening, the numbers told a different story. Of the 26 people present at the official opening of the burial chamber in February 1923, 18 lived for more than a decade afterward. Howard Carter himself, who was arguably more exposed to whatever was in that tomb than anyone else, lived until 1939, 17 years after the discovery, dying of lymphoma at the age of 64. If there was a curse targeting those who had disturbed Tutankhamun's rest, it had a remarkably poor aim. The pattern of deaths, when examined objectively, was not statistically unusual for a group of people that included elderly aristocrats, men with existing health conditions, and individuals working in an era when medical treatment was far less advanced than today. Lord Carnarvon himself had been in fragile health for years following his automobile accident. His death from an infected mosquito bite was tragic and dramatic, but it was not inexplicable. But statistics are not stories. And the human mind, wired for narrative, for pattern, for meaning, was not going to accept a statistical explanation when a supernatural one was so much more satisfying. The curse narrative served several purposes simultaneously. For the newspapers, it was a circulation bonanza. For a public still reeling from the losses of the First World War, it offered a sense that there were forces in the universe larger than human violence and suffering, that ancient wisdom and power still existed in the world. For those who had been excluded from the official coverage of the discovery, it was a way to participate in the story, to add something that the official account lacked. And there was something else at work, something more subtle and more interesting. The curse story was, in a peculiar way, a form of respect for the dead. Ancient Egyptians did believe in protective curses for tombs. Inscriptions warning of divine punishment for those who violated sacred spaces were not uncommon, though they were more typically found in the tombs of nobles and officials than in royal burials. The idea that the pharaoh's spirit, his Ka, remained in some sense present in the tomb and required protection was central to Egyptian religious belief. The elaborate process of mummification, the placement of grave goods, the sealing of the tomb, all of this was designed to ensure that the dead could continue their existence in the afterlife undisturbed. When Carter and Carnarvon broke through that sealed door, they were, from the perspective of ancient Egyptian theology, committing a profound violation. Not a crime in the modern legal sense, but a rupture of something sacred and intentional. The fact that the modern world reacted by inventing a curse was, in its strange way, an acknowledgement of that violation, a recognition that perhaps not everything old and buried should be dug up and put on display. This tension between the scientific imperative to understand the past and the ethical question of whether the dead deserve their rest has never been fully resolved. It runs through the entire history of Egyptology and reaches into the present day, where the question of whether mummies and their possessions should be returned to Egypt from museums around the world remains fiercely contested. But there is one more dimension to the curse story that deserves serious attention, because it is the dimension that comes closest to having a basis in physical reality. In 1962, a microbiologist named Ezzedine Taha published a study suggesting that archaeologists who worked with ancient mummies showed high rates of infection with a fungus called Aspergillus niger. This fungus, which can grow in enclosed spaces with organic material, can cause serious respiratory illness in people with compromised immune systems. Taha proposed that the curse might have a biological explanation. The tombs were contaminated with ancient mold and bacteria, and those who entered them were exposed to pathogens that modern medicine had never encountered. Tragically, Taha himself died in a car accident shortly after publishing his paper, which the superstitious took as further evidence of the curse's reach. But his scientific hypothesis was not without merit. Subsequent researchers have found evidence of various biological agents in ancient Egyptian tombs, including bacteria, mold spores, and in some cases the preserved remains of bat droppings, which can harbor the fungus responsible for histoplasmosis. Whether any of these agents were present in sufficient concentrations to cause illness, and whether they could have survived for 3,000 years in viable form, remains a matter of scientific debate. What is clear is that the tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed for over 3 millennia, contained organic material including food offerings, wooden objects, and the mummy itself that could theoretically have supported microbial life. Lord Carnarvon, with his already compromised respiratory system, would have been particularly vulnerable to any airborne pathogens in that environment. This is not a supernatural explanation, but it is a genuinely unsettling one. It suggests that the ancient Egyptians may have inadvertently created a biological deterrent to tomb robbery, not through magic or divine intervention, but through the simple chemistry of decomposition and enclosed space. The curse in this reading was real. It was just a different kind of curse than anyone had imagined. The story of Tutankhamun's curse did not end in 1923 or in 1939 when Carter died, or in any of the decades that followed. It has proven to be one of the most durable myths of the modern era, resurfacing every time the boy king's treasures travel to a new museum, every time a new study is published about his health or his death, every time someone with a camera and a microphone stands outside a sealed door and wonders what is waiting in the darkness on the other side. In 2005, Egyptian scientists used computed tomography to create a three-dimensional image of Tutankhamun's mummy, revealing the full extent of his physical conditions. He had a clubfoot. He suffered from multiple malaria infections. He had a fractured leg that may have become infected. The image of a powerful pharaoh, golden and eternal, was replaced by something more human and more poignant. A young man with a complicated genetic inheritance from a family that had practiced inbreeding for generations, who had lived in pain and died young, and who had then been used as a political symbol by the men who came after him. In 2010, DNA analysis confirmed that Tutankhamun was the son of Akhenaten and one of Akhenaten's sisters, a union that would have concentrated genetic vulnerabilities in their offspring. The boy king was not cursed by priests. He was, in a sense, cursed by his own biology, by the dynastic practices of a civilization that placed divine bloodlines above genetic diversity. And yet the golden mask endures. The image of that serene, beautiful face, the slightly parted lips, the striped headdress, the dark, coal-lined eyes gazing at eternity, has become one of the most recognized images in human history. More people know what Tutankhamun looked like in death than know what most living world leaders look like. He achieved in his 3,000-year sleep the immortality that ancient Egyptians believed was the ultimate purpose of existence. Howard Carter spent the rest of his life cataloguing the contents of the tomb. It was painstaking, meticulous work that consumed the better part of a decade. He worked largely alone after Carnarvon's death, without the aristocratic patron who had made the discovery possible, and with a complicated relationship with the Egyptian authorities who were increasingly asserting their right to control their own cultural heritage. He never married. He had few close friends. He was, by many accounts, a difficult man, prickly and proud, who had given everything to a single obsession, and found that the achievement of that obsession left him somewhat at a loss. He died in London in 1939, just as the world was once again sliding toward catastrophic war. His obituaries noted the discovery, of course, but some were surprisingly brief. The man who had found the greatest treasure in archaeological history was not, in the end, particularly famous in his own right. The curse, the mystery, the golden mask, these had overshadowed the patient, brilliant, unglamorous work that had actually made the discovery possible. There is a final irony to the story of the curse that is worth sitting with. The ancient Egyptians who built these tombs, who painted their walls with scenes of the afterlife, who wrapped their dead in linen and surrounded them with everything they might need for eternity, believed absolutely in the power of the name. To speak a name was to give life. To erase a name was to destroy a soul. This was why Horemheb's erasure of Tutankhamun from the historical record was considered such a devastating act. It was not merely political. It was, in Egyptian theological terms, a second death. And yet here we are, 3,000 years later, speaking his name. Tutankhamun, the living image of Amun, the forgotten boy king who was erased and then rediscovered and then transformed into a global icon. His name is spoken in 100 languages every day. His face is on posters and postcards and coffee mugs and textbook covers. The erasure failed completely. If there is a curse attached to this story, perhaps it belongs not to those who open the tomb, but to those who try to close history. Horemheb and I, who sought to unmake a pharaoh, are themselves largely forgotten. The generals and priests who chiseled away at cartouches and rewrote king lists are dust and silence, but the boy they tried to erase is immortal. The candle flame that trembled in Howard Carter's hand on that November night in 1922 illuminated more than golden artifacts and ancient furniture. It illuminated something about human nature, our hunger for mystery, our fascination with death, our need to believe that the universe contains forces larger than ourselves. The Curse of Tutankhamun was never really about a pharaoh's revenge. It was about us, about what we project onto the past, about what we need the past to mean. And in the end, the greatest wonder is not the gold, not the mask, not even the mummy sleeping in his stone sarcophagus in the valley where the kings were buried. The greatest wonder is that after 33 centuries of silence, a teenage boy who lived and suffered and died in a world utterly unlike our own still has the power to make us catch our breath, to make us lean forward in the dark, to make us ask the oldest question of all. What is waiting on the other side of the door? If this story captured your imagination the way it captured mine, take a moment to share it with someone who loves history and mystery in equal measure. And if you have your own theory about what really happened in that valley, whether you believe in the curse, the biology, or something else entirely, leave it in the comments below. The conversation around Tutankhamun has been going for 100 years and shows no sign of stopping. Subscribe so you do not miss the next chapter, because the ancient world still has secrets to give up, and we will be there when it does. But the question of the curse did not simply fade into academic debate and statistical analysis. It lived on in the physical world in ways that continued to unsettle even the most skeptical observers. In 1972, the treasures of Tutankhamun embarked on a world tour that would bring them to museums across Europe and North America. Millions of people queued for hours in the cold to stand before the golden mask, to look into those ancient eyes, to feel something they could not quite name. The exhibition was a cultural phenomenon unlike anything the art world had seen. And wherever the treasures traveled, the question followed like a shadow: was it safe to bring these things out of Egypt? Was the curse still active? The man responsible for approving the loan of the treasures was Muhammad Ibrahim, the head of Egypt's Department of Antiquities. He had opposed the tour on the grounds that the artifacts were too fragile to travel. He was overruled. The night before the treasures were officially approved for their journey abroad, Ibrahim had a dream in which he was warned that disaster would follow if the relics left their homeland. He dismissed it, signed the paperwork, and the next morning was struck by a car on his way to work. He died 2 days later. Coincidence, almost certainly, but the timing was the kind of thing that made people go quiet. The world tour proceeded without further incident, and the golden mask returned to Cairo intact. But the episode added another layer to a mythology that seemed to refresh itself with every generation. Each new discovery, each new study, each new controversy over the repatriation of Egyptian artifacts gave the curse story fresh oxygen. What the story of the curse ultimately reveals is something profound about the relationship between science and belief, between evidence and narrative. Human beings are not primarily rational creatures. We are storytelling creatures. We make sense of the world not through probability tables and statistical models, but through stories with characters, motivations, and consequences. The Curse of Tutankhamun was a story that gave shape and meaning to a series of events that might otherwise have seemed random and disconnected. It placed human experience inside a larger framework of cosmic justice, of ancient power demanding respect, of the past refusing to be simply consumed and catalogued and moved on from. And perhaps that instinct, however scientifically indefensible, contains a wisdom of its own. The dead were once alive. The objects in that tomb were not merely artifacts. They were the possessions of a real person, placed there with intention and love and the hope of eternity. The mummy in the golden coffin was once a child who ran and laughed and knew pain and fear and wonder. To treat that reality with a measure of reverence, even if that reverence expresses itself in the language of curses and supernatural warning, is not entirely without dignity. Tutankhamun's tomb remains in the Valley of the Kings. The mummy still rests in his outermost sarcophagus, returned there after decades of examination. The golden mask lives in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, where it has been seen by tens of millions of visitors. A new, larger museum near the pyramids at Giza has been built to house the full collection of his treasures, bringing them together for the first time since Carter removed them one by one over a decade of careful work from that small, crowded tomb in the valley. The boy king is home. The curse, whatever it was, whatever it meant, belongs now to history and to the endless human conversation about what we owe the dead, what the past owes us, and what happens when the light of the present falls, trembling and uncertain, into the long darkness of time. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about history, mystery, or the strange persistence of the past, then share it with someone who would feel the same. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on the curse. Do you believe there was something genuinely dangerous in that tomb? Or was it all coincidence amplified by imagination? Subscribe to stay with us as we continue exploring the moments that shape the world. There is always another sealed door waiting to be opened,